right, so Mary, it's our favourite time of year. It's Halloween. It is the superior Western holiday.
100%.
But, we are the Ghoul Guides, and I feel like it is our sacred duty to guide the ghouls. So I want to talk fact or fiction. And I want to talk ghost hunting.
I love it already.
I thought you might. Now, you and I are both incredibly skeptic. I think that's safe to say.
We look at things through a critical lens, I think.
We do not partake of the belief in ghosts. So, we are super, super skeptic. But for two people who are incredibly skeptic, we consume a lot of ghost hunting media.
I love ghost hunting shows, as you are aware, and I love the history of ghost hunting and spooky things. Yeah.
So, I think it's important that we kind of take a moment and think about ghost hunting as a phenomenon, because although I don't buy it, it fascinates me. And I think what better time to talk about this than Halloween? So this is Fact or Fiction with the Ghoul Guides, and we are talking ghost hunting.
Love it. Let's get to it.
Okay.
Let's hunt some ghosts.
Yeah. Okay, so I was thinking about how we could do this, and I think the best way to think about this is to think about, some of the more prominent or famous ghost hunting techniques, and why exactly do we use them to try to discover ghosts? Because here's the thing about ghost hunting. We have little to no scientific evidence that ghosts exist. We have a lot
shock me. You shock me. You telling me there's no evidence of ghosts?
Yes, Mary, I am telling you. I'm sorry to break your heart. There's very little scientific evidence. But what I find fascinating is, let's think about this from a sociological point of view. Why do we think that certain things inform us of the presence of ghosts? Now, of course, a lot of this, I could have done things like candles, mirrors, photographs, because there's lots of things that we as a global society have kind of wrapped up in spirituality and spiritualism. And that is, I think, a completely natural part of human evolution. We try and explain things that we can't explain. If I saw ball lightning, I would probably also think it was an angry spirit. That shit's wild. Have you seen it? It's insane. It just looks really cool. But, I can't explain that. I'm not a scientist. I probably also would be like, that's the supernatural. So a lot of the stuff that we think is proof of ghosts or ghost hunting has a really interesting history. But this is a YouTube video and not an encyclopedia. So I have picked you 3. And the first of my 3 is dowsing rods.
Dowsing rods?
So do you know what a dowsing rod is?
So, shockingly, I do. But please do explain to me, because they're basically supernatural metal rods, right? That
essentially
tell you things.
Now, dowsing rods are very much a pseudoscience. The idea behind dowsing rods, particularly in kind of old money science, sort of pre-digital science, and even, to be fair, in contemporary science, you can kind of see why people might think these work. So essentially, you have 2 metal rods that are shaped mostly like this, and you hold the rods in each hand. And the idea is that the rods swing backwards and forwards, and that they're responding to some kind of pull in the atmosphere. So traditionally, they've been used to search for things. So we think that dowsing as a concept dates back to ancient times. Pendants and things like that have been used for dowsing. It's often used to try and find water, but dowsing rods date back to 16th century Europe. And it seems that they originate in Germany, and they are used specifically to find metals. So the idea, kind of working off things like magnetism, the idea that these two rods would pull together. So it's supposed to be that if they push apart, you know, you're weak, it's not happening. If they come together and they cross over, that means that you are approaching your goal, essentially. So it's kind of like a navigation system.
Like supernatural ley lines. Like
Mary, don't mention ley lines to me. That's a whole other video. You know how I feel about ley lines. But yes, very kind of like ley lines. So you can kind of see why this becomes popular. You know that certain metals attract to each other. It's not a massive leap of logic to think that dowsing rods might be able to find precious metals. So dowsing rods become a way in which you could try and find good spots for mining. So this is all pretty, still it's pseudoscience, but it's pretty scientific. It's based around things we can prove, like magnetism. Problem is, a little guy called Martin Luther, who you may recall as the father of European Protestantism, decides that they break the first commandment. So Luther is like, no, dowsing rods are a cult. They are, this is unchristian, this is magic, this is occultism. These things should not be used. These are dangerous implements, and you're playing with forces that you don't understand. So he essentially blacklists dowsing rods.
I mean, that might be one of the smartest things that he ever did.
Potentially. However, as often with these things, it basically backfires. Because Luther says these are a cult, it essentially makes them more popular, because it's like, oh, well, they must have power then. So they keep growing in popularity. They keep, being produced. In 1662, a Jesuit named Gaspar Scott decides to call them satanic. So we go from occult to satanic. And this is where we essentially then start to get the supernatural coming into it. By rendering these things as occult and satanic, by, rejecting them, calling them unchristian, it ascribes to them a power and a meaning that they didn't really have before. So even though dowsing rods were still being used kind of like into the 19th century, particularly in the expansion in the US, people would use them to try and find water. And they have that kind of confirmation bias. They work often enough that people thought that actually they did work. But most of the science behind it kind of says it's basically based on probability. You are likely to actually, if you're looking for water, you're already going to be looking in a place where there's likely to be water. It's going to work often enough that you're more than likely to find it eventually. So the dowsing rods become popular, but because because Christianity brands them satanic, brands them other, brands them to be supernatural, they start to become popular in ghost hunting and seances. The idea being that if dowsing rods respond to electromagnetic fields, if they respond to energy, if they respond to some kind of motion, that spirits or ghosts or supernatural beings could essentially use them to communicate through. So they become used as implements in ghost hunting and seances. And I think it's like, if you ask it a question, if they cross over, it means yes. If they stay open, it means no. So this is an interesting one, because dowsing rods go from a pseudoscience that in the 16th century is pretty decent science, like for the time, to being something that is used to communicate supposedly with the undead. Okay, so I did state up top that we're incredibly skeptic. So I'm sure no one's going to be surprised when I say that I don't believe that this is fact. And I kind of feel like you're not going to disagree with me on this one.
I think I'm gonna need some, solid, hard evidence that the dowsing rods actually work. And every time that I have looked into this, I haven't seen any. So yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I agree with you.
Yeah. So, yeah, they are definitely fiction. But what's interesting here, and what I think is important to remember, is that they aren't a fiction that we pulled out of the ether. Like, these things are like 600 years old, and the reasoning behind them actually kind of makes sense. Like, I can understand why you would think that a dowsing rod would be able to have these type of capabilities. And I can understand why people use them. I can understand why people think they work the way they do. And what I think is really interesting is, if Martin Luther hadn't have branded these a cult, I don't know that they would ever have really taken off as a ghost hunting method.
So actually, his smart thing was not so smart after all.
No, it really wasn't. He made it worse.
Oh boy.
He made it way worse. Now, the interesting thing about dowsing rods leads me to my second ghost hunting method, Ouija boards.
Amazing. Love a good Ouija board.
Love a good Ouija board. Okay, so if you are not familiar with a Ouija board, it is a thin wooden board. Some of them can be quite small, some of them are larger, designed to be placed on a tabletop. And they have the letters of the alphabet, they have the numbers 1 to 10, and then they have yes, no, hello, goodbye. And the idea is that everybody sits around the table, and there's a little token, a little triangular piece of wood, and you all put 1 or 2 fingers onto the piece of wood, and then you ask questions. And the idea is that you open the board up, and then spirits can communicate with you through the board. And the idea is that you all kind of just put 1 finger on it, and the spirits move the token through you and then spell out their answers or whatever it may be. Now, Ouija boards actually also have a much older history. And really what they're dating back to is the concept of automatic writing. So do you know what automatic writing is, Mary?
I do, and I'm fascinated by it as a concept, of course.
Yes. I remember as a teenage girl, many a sleepover where we were like, let's try automatic writing. So automatic writing usually involves darkness and a focus, and then reaching a state of sort of trance and then writing. It exists in multiple different cultures. It was particularly popular in China around about 1100 AD. And essentially the idea is that you allow a spirit to speak through you. So this is very much coming up with the idea that you as a human being can act as some kind of focus. You're not necessarily allowing yourself to be possessed, but you're allowing yourself to connect with the spirit and then be moved by it and then write. There are people that have claimed to have written entire memoirs, entire novels in this way. And the way that you're supposed to do it, kind of the popular way that people do it now, is you turn the lights off, you go somewhere very quiet, you light a candle, you get paper and a pen, you close your eyes, you try and empty your mind, and then you let the pen move across the paper. And that is automatic writing. So the Ouija board is essentially an alternate version of automatic writing. So where does it actually come from? Well, in the 19th century, we have the rise of spiritualism, everybody's favorite pseudo-religious movement. Certainly had the best fashion. Let's be honest. So part of spiritualism was, of course, attempting as groups to communicate with the other side. So often this would involve seances, but seances would need a medium, somebody with a psychic connection to a spirit. So writing boards became really popular because they were something the whole group could do together. So the precursor to the Ouija board is the spirit or talking board. And these became really popular in spiritualist circles. And then in 1890, a guy was like, I can make money off this. which, to be honest, is the story to most things. So he patents the Ouija board, eventually sells it to the Hasbro company, and it's now a trademarked, patented thing. So you can only buy a proper Ouija board to this day from the Hasbro company.
It's like Hoover, and
Yes.
also I think more recently Zoom. We
Yes.
use these words to refer to. So Hoover is a brand of vacuum cleaners,
Mm-hmm.
but if someone says get me the Hoover, you know that they might not be referring to that specific brand. Same with Zoom.
Yep.
Obviously we've moved online in so many ways, and I think people are just using a Zoom call to
Yep.
mean just an online video call,
Yes.
whether you're using the platform Zoom or not.
Mm-hmm.
And this is exactly what happened with Ouija.
Yes.
So Ouija boards are, like you say, a specifically trademarked game.
Yeah.
They're a board game.
So this is the other thing, is that the Ouija board has only, so when Ouija as a concept, so we're talking about the spirit and talking boards, is at its height of its popularity, it's in the 19th century. It's not patented as Ouija until 1890, and it's sold as a parlor game. It isn't necessarily, I mean, there were people seriously using it as a seance tool, but it doesn't start to get that reputation. It's meant to be a fun parlor game, similar to the idea of automatic writing. The idea for a lot of people behind automatic writing is that, what does your subconscious come up with? And the fun thing about the Ouija board is that everybody's pushing it in different directions. So it's a parlor game. It's not actually a seance tool. It's a parlor game. And it kind of stays like that for a while. And guess what gives it its reputation for being a cult?
Oh, I don't know. Is it something satanic, maybe?
It's the church. So multiple Christian churches across the world, from Holland to the US, as this Ouija board grows in popularity, become concerned about it. And some of them petitioned Hasbro not to make them anymore, because it was a cult and potentially satanic. It was condemned, as misleading children, particularly the Satanic Panic in the 80s. But even before that, so like the beginning of the 20th century, it's Christian notoriety that causes the Ouija board to grow in popularity. And the more these Christian groups campaign against the Ouija board, the more that secular people began to regard it as an occult, possibly demonic, possibly supernatural piece of equipment. Now, what it actually is like the dowsing rod, it's an ideomotor response. So you are subconsciously exerting force onto the Ouija board. So even if you don't think that you're doing anything, and you don't think that anyone around you is moving, you are constantly exerting force, you're constantly twitching, in those very small ways that we can't really conceive. And that's what moves the Ouija board around. But of course, if you've got a group and you're all doing it, it's kind of that state of, I don't like to use the term hysteria, but that's kind of what's happening. It's that thing where if enough of you experience the same thing together, it becomes to feel real. There's actually a lot of scientific research been done into the Ouija board and how it works and why it works and why people believe it. But most scientists believe it's this ideomotor response. And because it's almost an imperceptible movement, that kind of means that we can be led to believe that it's supernatural. So again, I do not believe this is fact. It's an ideomotor response. It's just a piece of wood created by a children's toy company. However, once again, something that, so here, a bit different to the Dowsing Rods, this has always been something that we have considered to be something with a spiritual connection. But the Ouija board becomes the source of horror. We literally have a horror movie franchise called Ouija. Or Ouija, depending on how you pronounce it. So what I find really fascinating here is that the fiction, again, really has been created by the people trying to get rid of it. So the cult around the Ouija board that's grown up and the mythos around the Ouija board that's grown up is essentially the fault of religious factions that tried to get it banned for being potentially occult or demonic. They basically convinced people it was dangerous because they didn't like it. Up until then, it's kind of harmless. Like, some people regard it as a spiritual connection, some people regarded it as a subconscious expression of thought and feeling, but it was kind of like a harmless way of connecting and exploring. And then boom, Christianity gets involved, and now people think that it can be used as a doorway to let demons in and is dangerous for children. It's a parlor game.
I mean, it sounds just like, you know, a really fun game to play with your friends, maybe at night, maybe at Halloween.
Yeah.
So, you know,
why not try it? Like, what's the worst that could happen?
Exactly. What is the worst that can happen?
Okay, so my final fact or fiction. We're moving away from traditional, should we say traditional? I think that's the best way to term it. Traditional ghost hunting methods, and to the more contemporary. EMF and spirit boxes.
I love them. They're so much fun to watch.
They're so much fun. So, as probably most of you, if you're aware of us already, probably know, we love BuzzFeed Unsolved, and we love the spirit box. We think it's hilarious. Now, this is one of the ones where I think, again, the fact or fiction is interesting because, so EMF is electromagnetic fields. Now, I am a skeptic. I do not believe in ghosts. If you could show me definitive proof of ghosts, I would believe you. And I do accept that there are things that happen that we cannot explain in our current shared human understanding. But that's because I believe there are so many complicated things about the world that our scientific knowledge is not yet capable of comprehending. That being said, I will concede that if I thought anything was going to work, it would probably be EMF.
Now that is really interesting.
Now, the concept here is that ghosts or spirits disrupt electromagnetic fields. And we know that there are a lot of oddities that happen within electromagnetic fields. It's a relative, we've known about their existence for quite some time, but our ability to actually monitor them and track them is a relatively modern thing. And we get constant blips. There's lots of strange things that occur when we monitor EMF that we cannot explain. And we know that things have an effect on EMF, and we don't always know why. So I will accept that it makes sense to use EMF in ghost hunting. Because if ghosts are real, then the most likely thing is that either they are some kind of memory impression. We know that human beings, to a certain extent, have shared memory. It works the same as evolution. We know that inherently that certain things are safe or dangerous. So I could kind of maybe get behind the idea that there's some kind of residual. Like, if we're all made of atoms, perhaps if something terrible happens in a certain place, it leaves some kind of scar on the very matter of things. Or if we have souls and souls are real, or whatever you think spirits are made of, I can buy that the existence or the presence of a spirit would definitely probably disrupt an EMF. So this is a kind of where I think it gets really interesting, because this is, again, pseudoscience. And I think it's really fascinating that we as humankind keep kind of coming back to these pseudosciences. The Ouija board is kind of to the separate side here, but both the dowsing rods and the EMF essentially work on the same principles. One is just a more advanced version of the other, more or less. So, okay, sure. An EMF, if there was a ghost, could probably sense a ghost. Problem is, they're super unreliable, and lots of things affect electromagnetic fields. How do you prove that the disruption in your electromagnetic field is a ghost? What if it's a power line? What if it's like a temporal shift? Like, what if it's a tectonic shift? What if it's it could be anything. There's so many things that it
What
could
if
be.
you have tapped in to another like radio frequency,
Exactly.
or a couple, and they're kind of jumping around? It's, you know, we're in a really, like, our modern world is filled with so much technology, and
So much technology.
this is why I said it's really interesting that this for
Yes.
you is the one that could be real, because
Yeah.
for me, I think no, it's just radio, it's just radio frequencies, you know, or
So
like some kind of electrical slippage or something,
yes,
you know.
and I agree 100%. That's why I don't buy it. Like when people present it as evidence, like with the spirit box. The idea behind the spirit box, or the ghost box it's sometimes called, is that it changes radio frequencies at like some ridiculous, I think it's like a millionth of a second. It's some ridiculous kind of speed. My issue there is that radio frequencies aren't singular. And like most radio stations take up like 10 frequencies. Even if you're cycling through them super quickly, it's possible that you can just be catching, you know, a second of a whole radio station because it's taking up that many sections of the frequency. Like most radio stations are like 87 to 92. You know, they're not like, we are on 87.7 and that's it. You cannot find us anywhere else. But I will concede, these are things that we still don't always, and like you said with technology, we still don't fully understand the effect that our technology has on our environment. And we still don't fully understand how we as human beings respond to technology. We know that our atmosphere is full of things that we can't see. So I can kind of understand the idea behind why this would work. And if you believe in the supernatural, I can understand why a spirit box or an EMF reader, like if you were going to be like, come with me, I want to convince you that the ghosts are real, and you pulled out a Ouija board, I'd be like, no, that's an idiomotor response. If you pull out like an infrared, if you pull out a spirit box, if you pull out an EMF, then I can kind of be like, oh, yeah, okay. It's hard for me to explain the blips on those things. So what I guess, I know I build this as fact or fiction, and I am saying it's all fiction. I don't believe in any of it. What I think is really interesting is that as much as a skeptic as I am, all of these methods have very clear histories and have very clear pseudosciences behind them. They're not illogical necessarily. I find them irrational, but I wouldn't say that they are illogical, because in all situations and circumstances, the idea behind them kind of makes sense. And the more that you condemn something, and the more that you call something dangerous, and the more that you tell people they shouldn't do it because it's a cult, the more people are going to think that it is. Like if you grew up in a super religious community and someone was like, don't use a Ouija board because Satan will get you, you're going to be like, well, clearly this thing's powerful.
It's that whole idea of don't push the button.
Yes.
And even though, you know, do not push the button has the word not in it, it also has the words do and push and button. And you are then, you know, once you've had that kind of you know, restriction, that's what your brain is thinking. So yeah, of course you're gonna think about these things and want to do them, even though they're taboo or forbidden.
Yes, and the more taboo something becomes, the more power it has. And even the most rational and skeptic of people, if you are in a situation where strange things are happening and there's things you can't explain, you're gonna start to believe. And I think if you've always been told something's dangerous and you've always been told something's potentially demonic, even if you are not of faith, even if you are not superstitious, part of you is going to be afraid. And just to link it back to our brand, that's why ghost hunting is super gothic. Because fact or fiction, its evolution, its history, and its ideology is incredibly gothic. It's all based in religious creations of taboo, religious rejection. It's based on meta narratives. It's based on mythos. It's based on attempting to understand the human condition and attempting to look beyond the mortal coil, essentially. So, haha, sneak. I call this fact or fiction, but actually it was bit, is it gothic? Halloween special. Trick or treat.
Trick or treat. Amazing. I love it. I love it. And you know, even though I am equally skeptic, I still think there is an element of enjoyment and fun in these kinds of techniques, even if it is just, you know, scaring each other. You know, there's a reason why we as humans keep coming back to spooky ghost stories, or you know, gothic tales, or watching horror films, or going to a seance, or playing Ouija, or watching a ghost hunting show. It's because there's something in these stories, whether we're viewing or participating in them, that is thrilling. And yeah, I think we get a lot of enjoyment from that.
Exactly. Yeah, I know I do. And that, ghouls, is the true spirit of Halloween. And this has been our Ghoul Guide Halloween special. Fact or fiction? Stay safe, stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.